In the spring of 1944, the most dangerous battlefield in Europe was not a coastline, a city, or a line on a map. It was a belief, inside Germany's intelligence system. That belief had been forming quietly for months, reinforced not by one report, but by dozens. Not by a single source, but by an entire network that appeared on paper to agree with itself. To Adolf Hitler, this was proof. The Allies, he was convinced, would strike at Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest crossing, the most logical route, the place where any rational enemy would attack. And rationality, Hitler believed, was something he understood better than his opponents. What he did not see, what he could not see, was how completely that belief had been engineered. The intelligence network feeding Berlin did not lie outright. It rarely needed to. Instead, it selected. It emphasized. Confirmed. Each piece of information fit neatly into an expectation that already existed. This was not coincidence. British intelligence had learned long ago that deception works best when it does not fight the enemy's assumptions, but completes them. And by 1944, German intelligence had become deeply predictable, not in what it knew but in how it judged. The Abwehr, once independent and cautious, had been weakened by political pressure and internal rivalry. Reports traveled upward through layers that discouraged contradiction. Analysts learned which conclusions were welcomed and which were quietly buried. Over time, intelligence ceased to function as warning. It became reassurance. Double agents played a central role in this transformation. Many of them were already trusted by the Germans, men and women whose information had proven accurate in the past. Their value lay not in sudden invention, but in consistency. They reported troop movements, preparations, rumors, all pointing toward Calais. Nothing dramatic, nothing implausible, just enough to keep the picture intact. Radio traffic reinforced it. Phantom units appeared on German maps, complete with command structures and logistical footprints. Inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft were placed where reconnaissance aircraft could see them. The illusion was physical, audible, and methodical. Most importantly, it was patient. The intelligence network did not rush to convince. It allowed German analysts to convince themselves. Each report validated the last. Doubt, when it arose, was smoothed away by volume. And volume creates confidence. Inside Hitler's headquarters, intelligence briefings grew increasingly certain. Not because new truth had been discovered, but because the narrative had achieved coherence. Everything pointed in the same direction. That coherence mattered more than accuracy. Hitler trusted intelligence when it aligned with his instincts. He distrusted it when it challenged them. The network understood this, whether consciously or not. And so it delivered what the system rewarded. By early June, the idea that Normandy might be the true invasion site existed only as a possibility, acknowledged but minimized. If landings occurred there, they would be a diversion. Probe. A sacrifice meant to draw German forces away from the real blow. This belief did not originate on June 6. It had been cultivated. When the first reports arrived from Normandy in the early hours of that morning, they were filtered through this expectation. Paratroopers? A diversion? Naval bombardment? A feint? Confused fighting along unfamiliar beaches? Evidence that the Allies were willing to spend lives to mislead. The intelligence network absorbed the shock and explained it away. And in that explanation, the trap was complete. Hitler did not ignore the reports. He interpreted them. An interpretation, shaped by months of reinforced belief, proved stronger than observation. Armored reserves were held back. Commanders were told to wait. The intelligence insisted that the decisive moment had not yet arrived. Behind closed doors, the network continued to speak with confidence. Not because it was certain, but because certainty was expected. The most dangerous moment in intelligence work is not when information is missing, but when it appears finished. When all questions seem answered. When doubt feels unnecessary. That was the moment Germany had reached. As the day unfolded, the network that had convinced Hitler D-Day was a trap continued to do its work, not by acting, but by maintaining silence where urgency was required and clarity where uncertainty should have been acknowledged. And in that silence, shaped carefully over time, Decisions were delayed that could never be recovered. The intelligence network did not collapse under the weight of events. It adapted to them. As reports multiplied from Normandy, the same mechanisms that had built certainty now absorbed contradiction. New information was not rejected outright. It was reframed. Landings were acknowledged, but their scale was questioned. Allied persistence was noted, but explained as necessity. The absence of a second blow at Pas-de-Calais was interpreted not as absence, but as patience. The network had learned how to protect a belief. Within German headquarters, this protection took the form of delay. Delay in releasing armored divisions. Delay in shifting air assets. Delay in accepting that the moment-demanding decision had already passed. Each delay felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed paralysis. What made the situation especially dangerous was that no single individual could be blamed. The intelligence network functioned as a collective reassurance. Each officer relied on the consensus. Each report leaned on another. Responsibility dissolved into structure. And structure, once established, resists urgency. Hitler listened to his intelligence because it spoke with one voice. That unity mattered more to him than accuracy. Disagreement suggested weakness. Agreement suggested control. And control was something he could not afford to lose. The Allies understood this dynamic. They did not attempt to silence German intelligence. They amplified it. Every double-agent report, every intercepted signal, every visible preparation was designed to strengthen the existing conclusion. Even uncertainty was shaped, carefully bounded so it never threatened the central belief. The trap was not that Normandy was ignored. The trap was that Normandy was explained. Inside the intelligence network, analysts took pride in coherence. They had built a picture that made sense. To abandon it would be to admit that months of careful work had been misdirected. And in a system where error carried personal and political risk, coherence became survival. Fear played its part. Fear of contradiction. Fear of being wrong at the wrong time. Fear of telling a leader something he did not wish to hear. These fears did not require orders. They were understood. So when the question arose, what if this is the main invasion? It was not suppressed. It was softened, reduced to a possibility among many. And possibilities do not compel action. Certainty does. As hours turned into days, the intelligence network continued to operate exactly as it had been trained. Collected, filtered, aligned. But it no longer challenged. It no longer disrupted expectation. In effect, it insulated Hitler from the urgency of reality. This insulation did not break immediately. It thinned. It stretched. But it held long enough for the Allied foothold to deepen, for logistics to stabilize, for momentum to become irreversible. The tragedy of the network was not incompetence. It was discipline without doubt. By the time cracks appeared, by the time the absence of a second invasion at Calais could no longer be ignored, the intelligence had lost its power to influence events. It could describe the situation, but it could no longer change it. And Hitler, still trusting the structure that had guided him thus far, found himself making decisions inside a framework that no longer matched the war outside his window. This was the final consequence of the network's success. It had convinced him not only that D-Day was a trap, but that his own judgment, reinforced by intelligence, was sufficient. And that belief, once fully formed, would not be undone quickly. Unraveling did not come as revelation, came as erosion. By the third and fourth days after the landings, the intelligence network was no longer confident in the way it had been before, but it remained consistent. And consistency, even weakened, still carried authority. Reports became more cautious, but they did not abandon their central claim. Pas-de-Calais was still described as the decisive objective. Normandy, though clearly dangerous, was framed as a commitment born of necessity, not design. This distinction mattered, because as long as Normandy could be interpreted as secondary, the most critical decisions could still be postponed. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere shifted from certainty to tension. Conversations shortened. Maps were studied in silence. Intelligence officers no longer offered sweeping conclusions. They offered summaries, restrained, carefully balanced, designed to avoid provoking contradiction. What none of them could say openly was that the network had reached a point where truth itself had become disruptive. To acknowledge that the invasion was genuine would mean admitting that the entire structure, agents, analysts, assumptions, had failed at the moment it was needed most. It would mean admitting that the enemy had not merely deceived Germany, but understood it. That realization carried consequences far beyond Normandy. So the network hesitated, continued to function, but without courage. And in war, intelligence without courage becomes dangerous. Hitler sensed the change, though he did not name it. He grew more withdrawn, more suspicious, but also more dependent on the same intelligence that had guided him thus far. He demanded reassurance even as he sensed its fragility. This dependency deepened the trap. Each report that maintained the possibility of a second invasion justified holding back reserves. Each hour that passed without movement at Pas-de-Calais reinforced the belief that patience was still warranted. The absence of confirmation became confirmation itself. The network had created a logic that could not be disproven by waiting. Meanwhile, field commanders in France felt the consequences directly. They saw the scale of the Allied commitment. They felt the pressure growing. Requests for flexibility increased. The answers, when they came, were delayed, conditional, or incomplete. The intelligence network did not deny the danger. It diluted it, and dilution over time is enough. By the time Hitler's confidence in the Calais theory truly began to fracture, the question was no longer whether Normandy was the main invasion. It was whether anything could still be done about it. At that point, intelligence could only describe the loss of opportunity, could not restore it. The network that had convinced Hitler D-Day was a trap had achieved its final effect. Not by keeping him blind, but by keeping him undecided long enough for decision to lose its power. And in that narrow space between belief and doubt, between certainty and hesitation, the course of the war continued to shift, quietly, irreversibly, toward an outcome that no intelligence report could now prevent. The intelligence network did not end with exposure. It ended with acceptance. Not acceptance of truth, but acceptance that the moment for decisive correction had passed. By then, the reports arriving in Berlin no longer asked what the enemy intended. They recorded what had already occurred. Intelligence had become history, and history does not issue commands. Hitler continued to trust the structure that had shaped his thinking, even as it failed him. He did so not out of blindness, but out of habit. To abandon it would have meant confronting a reality in which judgment itself had been compromised. That confrontation never fully came. Instead, the war moved forward under the weight of decisions delayed rather than decisions made. The trap, once believed, no longer required reinforcement. It had already done its work. D-Day would be remembered as a triumph of courage and sacrifice. But beneath that story lay another, quieter and more decisive, the story of an intelligence network that did not need to lie loudly to succeed. It only needed to be trusted. And once that trust became certainty, the course of the war shifted not with a single order, but with the absence of one. That absence, measured in hours, then days, became irreversible. And in that silence, shaped carefully long before the first landing craft moved, the outcome of the war had already begun to take form.